From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Wednesday, October 11. Over the weekend, the Palestinian militant group Hamas achieved what no one thought was possible.
A terrifying new era is tonight unfolding in the Middle East. Israel has declared war after Hamas militants launched a surprise coordinated attack, the scale of which is hard to believe.
Under the cover of a hail of thousands of deadly missiles that overwhelmed Israel's vaunted Iron Dome defenses, invading Hamas militants freely roamed residential streets. They took dozens of Israeli civilians at will and left hundreds dead.
More than 700 Israelis are now feared dead after unprecedented attacks by Hamas militants. It represents the biggest loss of life in a single day in Israeli history.
Since then, Israel has responded with force, launching airstrikes that killed nearly 300 Palestinians in 24 hours.
Palestinian officials say more than 300 are dead in the Gaza Strip and almost 2,000 injured.
And the country's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has declared war on Hamas, vowing to exact mighty vengeance.
We are at war. Not an operation, not rounds, but at war. This morning,
Israel has now imposed a total blockade of the Gaza Strip, leaving residents with no electricity, food, water, or gas. Meanwhile, Hamas is threatening to execute a hostage every time civilian homes are bombed without warning. Hamas says it has more than 100 hostages. One of those hostages, according to United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken, is a wheelchair-bound Holocaust survivor. There is much speculation about why Hamas decided to carry out this deadly invasion now. And according to our political and international editor, Peter Hartcher, understanding the timing behind this attack will help us understand why this war isn't just a savage new round in the Israeli-Palestinian struggle, and why instead it signals that a much bigger conflict is afoot. Today, he joins me to discuss why this latest struggle between Israelis and Palestinians is so different. So, Peter, a lot has happened in Israel and Gaza over the last few days. On Saturday, Hamas launched a full-scale attack on Israel, infiltrating the country by land, air, and sea. It's something that I know a lot of people didn't think was possible. Many, like myself, have watched on in shock and horror. But a lot has happened already since Saturday. So can you update us on what's taken place over the last few days?
Well, the key characteristic of this was it was a surprise attack aimed at civilians.
Their attack as brutal as it was brazen. Hundreds killed. For Israel, that's included scores of unarmed civilians as well as soldiers. Already the largest loss of life in decades.
It was carefully coordinated, large scale, where 22 towns were infiltrated by foot on the ground. And contrary to all experience and expectations, the Hamas fighters were able to enter suburban streets, villages, homes, without any interference. These places were not protected. The Israeli Defense Force was caught off guard, so were the intelligence services. Important to note here, so were the Americans. They picked up nothing in advance. And then hunting down civilians in their homes, murdering some, kidnapping others, and of course there was the music festival.
A carefree crowd. They have no idea of the horror about to erupt. Images posted on social media show people running for their lives. Witnesses say that after rockets were fired, Palestinian gunmen began attacking from several directions.
250 or so were butchered and some taken hostage. And it took the Israeli Defense Force days to remove all of the Hamas fighters, I'm still not sure if they've got every one of them, out of Israeli territory. That was the key characteristic, a surprise assault on civilian populations, to which then, of course, Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, has responded with a declaration of war and intensive bombardments, practically non-stop airstrikes into Gaza, which is where Hamas is based.
Israel's response has been swift and harsh.
And we see a rapid rise of casualties initially on the Israeli side. Now we see them rapidly rising as well on the Palestinian side.
Jets have been hitting what they say are Hamas positions. But many civilians have also been killed in this densely populated Palestinian enclave, blockaded and nowhere else to flee.
And I say Palestinian because it's not just Hamas fighters who are being killed by the bombardments in Gaza. It's also, of course, Palestinian civilians.
And I was hoping you could give us a little more context into why this war is so different, because we know that Israel has been locked in a violent cycle with Palestinian militant groups for decades. So can you take us through how this is different? Because you've written that this is very different to what we've seen previously.
Yeah, and the scale of it is one thing, the multi-pronged aspect, the land, sea, air thing, where motorised hang gliders were used to get Hamas fighters into Israeli territory. The mechanics were different. The scale was different. The stealth aspect was different. And the direct targeting of civilians in their homes rather than targeting of the IDF, the Defence Force, or targeting of the external borders, this was a direct intrusion into what people considered to be their suburban sanctity, really. And the initial barrage of missiles, there were, according to the Israeli side, at least 2,500 missiles, some of which were homemade, but others were more sophisticated. How do you account for that? And this is obviously long planned and carefully executed. The reason is that this was not just an organic mission run by Hamas. It was conducted with the support, encouragement, and financing of its great sponsor, the state of Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran. And it was designed to be something other than just a normal, forgive me for using that word, but part of the normal cycle of violence and counter-violence between Hamas and the Israeli army. It was designed to be an extreme provocation.
So tell us a bit more about the involvement between Iran and Hamas. Why would Iran want Hamas to have launched this attack? What's in it for Iran?
So you have to take a step back, and we have to take ourselves out of the context of looking at this as just another outbreak of the traditional, or a more intense outbreak of the traditional, almost non-stop tit-for-tat violence that goes on between Israel and the Palestinians. We have to take a step back and look at essentially global strategy here, because the US has long had a goal of trying to encircle Iran as an enemy state. And Iran, on the other hand, has long wanted to encircle Israel. Now, what was going on in recent months was that Iran was feeling in danger of the US being able to close that circle around it. And the last part of the deal was to be a normalization of Saudi relations with one of Iran's other great enemies, which is Israel. So this would have seen an entente cordiale between the US, the Saudis, and the Israelis.
Okay, and so very briefly, Peter, can you give us a bit of context about this Israeli-Saudi deal that Washington has been trying to broker? What is actually in it for the US, and why would Saudi Arabia, which has long been a traditional foe of Israel, even consider this?
Well, the Americans' main motivation is a strategic one, as the US has been pulling back from its former engagement with the Middle East. They're trying to preserve as much peace and stability as possible for their great regional ally, Israel, but also they're allied with the Saudis, and the particular and imminent threat has long been Iran, and that's only got worse in recent years. So from the American point of view, it's about grand strategy. How do we pull back while leaving security for Israel and showing support for the Saudis and trying in the process to restrain Iran? So that's what it was trying to achieve. For the Saudis, it's more specific. They want American F-35 aircraft. They want a range of American weaponry and munitions valued around $30 billion. That's on their immediate shopping list. And they see many other benefits flowing. So that's the broad picture. And to wreck that plan and break that encirclement, Iran used and planned with Hamas to launch this dramatic attack to provoke a major Israeli response, which would then interrupt the rapprochement underway between Israel and the Saudis. Because obviously, the moment the Israelis are seen to be bombarding Gaza and killing Palestinians, then the Saudi government has to pull back from any appearance of that it's cozying up to Israel, and that's underway.
We'll be right back. Okay, but we know that Iran has actually denied any responsibility for the attack. But you and many other commentators continue to speculate that it is actually Iran that is behind this unprecedented attack on Israel. So are there any other hallmarks that signal clear Iranian involvement in this?
Yes. Well, I'm not speculating, Samantha. We have reporting. So a spokesman for Hamas has told the BBC on the record, and the BBC has published this, that it was fully supported by Iran. We have statements from the Iranians that they fully support this attack, although not specifying the details about exactly how, when, why, and what support it gave. We have a speech by the Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme ruler of Iran, 4 days before this attack, in which he said that the downfall of the usurper regime, as he calls Israel, was drawing near, that the youth were more capable and spirited and determined to destroy Israel, and he wished them all the best. And we know, thanks to reporting from the Wall Street Journal over the last couple of days, that this negotiation or this planning by Hamas, coordinated by Tehran, by the Iranian government, by the Ayatollahs, started at least in April, that the Iranian government, the head of the Quds Force, which is the elite branch of the military in Iran, was convening regular meetings with the heads of Hamas and other terrorist militia maintained by Iran. So this was a coordinated, long-planned and careful strategy run out of Iran. This is not just terrorists in Gaza who decide they want to kill Israelis. This is much bigger.
Okay, and I wanted to step back from Iran for a moment and just ask you about the timing of this, the timing of when Hamas has actually attacked Israel. Do you think that Hamas chose now, or a few days ago, to attack because it perceived Israel as being in a particularly weak position? We know that there have been protests and instability within Israel for many, many months prior to this because of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's attempts to curtail the judiciary. So is that at play here?
Yes, and that's been going on, as you say, since January, and we've had multiple warnings internally in Israel. For example, the chief of the Army General Staff in, I think, July in Israel said that because of the unrest, because of the distraction, because of the fact that many Israeli reservists were refusing to be called up as a sign of protest against the Netanyahu government and sympathetic with the street protests that have been occurring every week now for nearly 40 weeks, that the chief of staff actually said it would put Israel's existence at risk. So the Israelis could see the risk on their own side, and that may well have been a factor in the planning here from Tehran and from Gaza. But the other factor is that the Saudis were edging closer with the Americans and the Israelis to a deal. And a few weeks ago, the Saudi Crown Prince said, "We are getting closer every day." So it was imminent. This encirclement, to put it from the viewpoint of the Iranians, was about to be closed. So the Iranians obviously thought they were running out of time. Israel, it's a bit of an opportunistic, it's a bit of a maybe just a bonus that the Israelis were particularly inattentive. But again, the Americans didn't pick this up either. So this was an extremely stealthy, careful operation that's been carried out by Hamas.
And on the other side of it, on the Israeli side, an absolute spectacular failure of intelligence. Israel is known for having great intelligence in the region. Do you have any thoughts on that, on how there could be such a failure of intelligence here?
Well, so if it was a failure of intelligence by the Israelis, it was also a failure of intelligence by the Americans. So we have to assume that there have been particular countermeasures that the Iranians and the Hamas fighters have taken to conceal their planning, to evade any detection. I imagine we'll find out a lot more about this in the weeks to come. But it has to be acknowledged that this wasn't just an Israeli failure. This was also a whole new level of stealthiness from Hamas.
And what has Hamas itself said about this?
They've said that it's simply retaliation for Israeli abuse and repression of the Palestinian people, particularly the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is a holy site for both Muslims and Jews, but which is managed by Israel and where the Israelis have been increasingly making conditions difficult for Muslims to access, to worship, and they've been the centre of a lot of intense politicking. So they've said that they've reduced it really to those local grievances of the Palestinian people to make it the most, I suppose, palatable excuse or pretext for an attack on Israeli civilians. They've not exposed any of the larger geopolitical thinking. They've said it's simply to repay the Israelis.
Right. But of course, as you've mentioned, this is an attack, unlike we've seen in 50 years on Israel. Israel's has now the biggest mobilization of troops that perhaps it's ever had. And you've said that Israel could be at risk of dismemberment under assault from multiple sides. So what did you mean when you wrote that? Is Israel at risk of losing territory, losing the war?
Yes and yes, I would say, are the short answers. We don't yet know how far Iran wants to escalate. But if it does, it has some very powerful assets that it can activate. So we've seen already Hamas is attacking Israel from the Gaza Strip in the south. We also see, so far, just a very limited and pretty much routine exchange of fire on the northern border with Lebanon, where Hezbollah, another Iranian-backed terrorist militia, is based. Now, if the Iranians decide to engage Hezbollah, if Hezbollah's leadership decides to start a full-scale attack on Israel from the north, they've got huge stockpiles of missiles, more than 100,000 missiles apparently, and they've got a strong track record of performing pretty well in military clashes with Israel. So they can be activated from the north as well as Hamas from the south. And then Iran also has militias and proxy forces operating in Syria, which could be activated to attack as well. Plus, Iran, if it chose, could attack Israel directly, which it's something it's always avoided. It doesn't want Israeli missiles aimed at Tehran, much less Israeli nuclear missiles or American nuclear missiles. So Iran's always been wary of that, but it just depends here on how far and how hard Iran wants to escalate. While the Israelis, having mobilized, as you said, at least 300,000 reservists, are now going to be concentrated on trying to root out the Hamas leadership supporters' hostages that they've taken, Israeli hostages that they've taken, and munitions from Gaza. That's going to be an intensive operation and a very difficult one. So with all that going on, Israel is vulnerable to a multi-pronged attack from Iranian proxies and militias and possibly Iran directly itself. So yes, as a former Israeli national security advisor said on the weekend, this is an existential moment for Israel.
Well, thank you, Peter, for joining us.
Yeah, it's never very happy news when we talk Samantha, and I'm afraid this is particularly grim and horrific.
It is. I feel like we'll be speaking about it probably sooner rather than later.
I'm afraid so.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Chi Wong. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.
Why do we have to choose one? With Optus, you can have it all. Get a great network with super fast 5G. Get value with 5G phone price match guarantee. Get amazing features like mobile turbocharge. With Optus, you can simply have it all. It starts with yes. 5G available in selected areas and on selected plans. Speeds vary. Check website for coverage and offer details, including T's and C's, exclusions, eligibility criteria and prices.